What if the British Empire survived until today? The empire that refused to die. How Britain could have built the world's largest superstate. The point of divergence. The most plausible survival point for the British Empire is not 1947, not Suez, and not the late Cold War. By then, the direction of history was already moving against imperial rule. The real point of divergence has to come earlier, before Indian independence became inevitable, before America fully inherited global leadership, and before the empire became morally impossible to defend in its old form. The key moment is 1931, the Statute of Westminster. In real history, that law confirmed the legislative independence of the self-governing dominions, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, by declaring that Dominion parliaments had full powers to make their own laws and that future UK laws would not automatically apply to them without consent. It was the legal moment when the old imperial structure began openly turning into a looser Commonwealth. In this alternate timeline, Britain does something more radical. Instead of treating Dominion autonomy as the beginning of imperial loosening, it treats it as the constitutional foundation for a new empire-wide federation. London understands that the choice is not between absolute control and collapse. The choice is between a federal empire with shared power or no empire at all. That sounds cleaner than it would have been. The British ruling class would not suddenly become enlightened. Racism, hierarchy, protectionism, and imperial arrogance would still exist. But a small coalition of strategic imperial reformers, Dominion politicians, Indian federalists, business leaders, and military planners could plausibly recognize one. Brutal fact, after the First World War, no empire can survive indefinitely if hundreds of millions of people are governed without meaningful political representation. The old British Empire reached its peak after the First World War, when it governed roughly a quarter of the world's land and a vast share of the global population. Its scale was not the problem. Its political structure was. It was too large to be governed as a hierarchy, and too valuable to be allowed to simply dissolve without a fight. The divergence, therefore, is not that Britain becomes more powerful. It is that Britain becomes more realistic. Saving the empire. In this timeline, the shock of the First World War creates a sharper imperial reckoning. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India all contributed soldiers, resources, and political legitimacy to Britain's war effort. Instead of returning to a system where London speaks and the empire obeys, the post-war settlement produces a serious imperial constitutional convention in the 1920s. The proposal is not full equality at first. That would be too far for the Britain of the period. But it does create an imperial council with binding authority over defense, trade, migration, currency coordination, and foreign policy. The dominions receive greater influence over strategy. India receives a staged path towards full federal representation rather than delayed constitutional bargaining. This is where the survival strategy begins. Britain stops pretending India can be permanently governed as a possession. It also stops assuming the white dominions will remain emotionally loyal without institutional power. The empire begins shifting from hierarchy to bargain, remain inside the imperial system, and receive trade access, defense protection, infrastructure investment, parliamentary representation, and increasing domestic autonomy. The old empire offered order in exchange for obedience. The new imperial system offers influence in exchange for membership. The decisive change comes in India. In real history, the Indian Independence Act of 1947 created the independent dominions of India and Pakistan and partitioned Punjab and Bengal, triggering one of the largest forced migrations in modern history. In this alternate timeline, Britain begins serious Indian federalization 2 decades earlier, before the final crisis becomes unmanageable. That does not mean partition disappears automatically. Hindu-Muslim political tension still exists. The Muslim League still fears permanent domination inside a Hindu-majority democratic system. Congress still demands real power. The princely states still complicate everything. But earlier, federal reform changes the incentives. Instead of asking whether India should leave the empire, the central question becomes how India, Pakistan, Bengal, Punjab, and the princely states fit inside a wider imperial federation with provincial autonomy, communal protections, and shared defense. The result is messy, fragile, and morally compromised. But it is not fantasy. It is a delayed breakup model converted into a federal containment model. India does not remain a colony. It becomes the largest member state inside a British-led imperial federation. The Imperial Federation. The Imperial Federation is formally created after the Second World War. The war still happens. Britain still fights Nazi Germany. The empire still mobilizes troops, shipping, industry, and food supply across continents. But the political consequences are different, because the imperial bargain already exists. By 1946, Britain is financially exhausted. It cannot afford to govern the empire in the old way. In real history, this exhaustion accelerated decolonization. In this timeline, it accelerates federalization. London has no money to police nationalist movements everywhere, so it offers a hard constitutional bargain: full internal self-government, federal voting rights, shared citizenship, and guaranteed development funds in exchange for remaining inside the Imperial Federation. The name changes quickly. British Empire becomes politically toxic, especially in Asia and Africa. By the 1950s, the official name becomes the Commonwealth Federation. The monarchy remains as a symbolic head of state at first, but executive power moves into federal institutions. London remains important, but it is no longer the unquestioned imperial capital. Delhi, Ottawa, Canberra, Cape Town, Lagos, and Singapore become federal power centers. The federation has 3 levels. Local governments control education, policing, health, land, culture, and most taxation. Member state governments control domestic law, industry, welfare, and infrastructure. The federal government controls defense, external trade, currency coordination, migration rights, strategic infrastructure, intelligence, and foreign affairs. This is the survival mechanism. The empire survives only by ceasing to behave like an empire. The greatest constitutional battle is representation. If the federation is democratic by population, India dominates immediately. If it is controlled by London and the White Dominions, India eventually leaves. The compromise is a bicameral structure. A lower federal assembly is elected broadly by population. An upper Commonwealth Senate gives weighted representation to member states and regions. Major constitutional changes require both demographic legitimacy and regional consent. This produces a system that is powerful but permanently tense. India believes it deserves more influence. Britain fears becoming a symbolic island inside a giant post-imperial machine. Canada and Australia resist being dragged into Asian security crises. African territories demand faster development and equal citizenship. South Africa becomes the Federation's most dangerous internal moral crisis, because apartheid cannot survive indefinitely inside a multiracial constitutional order. In this timeline, South Africa either reforms earlier under crushing federal pressure, or leaves temporarily and returns later under democratic government. There is no stable version of a multiracial Commonwealth Federation that can permanently tolerate apartheid without destroying its legitimacy. The Federation's central truth is simple. It saves British global power, but it destroys British imperial supremacy. The world reshaped. America reacts with suspicion first. The United States did not fight a revolution against Britain, only to welcome a rebranded British superstate dominating world trade, sea lanes, and global finance. Washington's strategic class sees the Commonwealth Federation as both partner and rival. During the early Cold War, however, America has limited room to oppose it. a democratic anti-Soviet federation stretching across the Atlantic, Indian Ocean and Pacific is too valuable to destroy. The United States would rather compete with a British-led federation than watch India, Southeast Asia, Africa, and the Middle East become unstable battlegrounds for Soviet influence. The relationship becomes a colder version of the real special relationship. America is still the richer industrial giant after 1945. It still has the atomic bomb first. It still leads much of the Western alliance, but it does not inherit the same uncontested global role. The Commonwealth Federation controls strategic ports, shipping networks, intelligence bases, raw materials, Indian manpower, Australian minerals, Canadian energy, and British financial institutions. Suez becomes the great test. In real history, the 1956 crisis exposed Britain's weakened status, with intense American pressure helping force withdrawal after Egypt nationalized the canal. In this alternate timeline, there is no simple Anglo-French adventure. The Federation cannot act without Indian, Canadian, Australian, and African political consent. That makes reckless imperial military action harder. The outcome is less dramatic, but more strategic. Instead of invading Egypt, the Federation pushes for international canal guarantees, financial pressure, maritime alternatives, and a negotiated security regime. Britain loses some prestige, but avoids the humiliation that confirmed its post-imperial weakness in real history. America remains irritated, but it cannot treat the Federation like a fading European ally. It has to treat it as a second Western pole. Europe develops differently too. Britain does not join the European project in the same way because its economic horizon is not primarily continental. The European coal and steel community and later European integration still emerge from Franco-German necessity. But Britain remains outside as the anchor of a rival global trading bloc. This changes Europe's psychology. France pushes harder for European strategic autonomy. Germany becomes even more central to continental economics. The European Union still forms, but it is more explicitly a continental power project rather than a broad Western European settlement, including Britain. Europe becomes deeper but narrower, more French-German in character, and more anxious about being trapped between America and the Commonwealth Federation. The Cold War becomes tripolar, inside the West. America leads NATO's hard military edge. Europe builds economic integration. The Commonwealth Federation controls sea lanes, development finance, Indian Ocean strategy, and much of the democratic global South. China develops under a different shadow. China still becomes one of the central powers of the 21st century, but its path is altered by the survival of a coherent Commonwealth bloc. The Chinese Civil War may still end with communist victory in 1949, because the forces driving that outcome were domestic, military, and social. The difference is the environment around China. In real history, China eventually rose into a global manufacturing superpower by integrating into a US-led trading system. In this alternate timeline, there are two major capitalist democratic economic systems, the American sphere and the Commonwealth sphere. China can still exploit globalization, but it faces a stronger India-linked counterweight from the beginning. Hong Kong becomes more complicated. If the Commonwealth Federation exists, Britain has less incentive to treat Hong Kong as a lonely late imperial possession and more incentive to turn it into a federal Asian financial capital. Its handover to China becomes less automatic, more negotiated, and more globally charged. Beijing still sees Hong Kong as Chinese territory, but the Federation sees it as a strategic, legal financial gateway into Asia. This does not mean Britain keeps Hong Kong forever. That is unlikely. Geography and Chinese power still matter. But the transition may produce a different arrangement, a longer autonomy treaty, deeper international guarantees, or a Singapore-style relocation of financial functions into a federal Asian hub before Chinese sovereignty is fully restored. China's biggest problem in this world is India. A federal India with access to Commonwealth capital, universities, naval protection, technology flows, and global markets industrializes earlier and more coherently. It still faces poverty, bureaucracy, communal tension, and regional inequality. But it is not a newly independent state forced to build everything from a traumatized partition settlement. The Sino-Indian balance is therefore sharper. China does not face a fragmented post-colonial South Asia. It faces a vast democratic federation-backed India that sits inside one of the world's most powerful military and trade systems. The Himalayas become not just a disputed frontier, but the line between two civilizational-scale blocks. China still rises, but it rises into a more crowded world. India develops as the Federation's giant. India is the central reason the empire can survive, and the central reason it can never remain British in the old sense. By population, economic potential, and strategic geography, India becomes the Federation's indispensable member. Without India, the surviving empire is just a richer Commonwealth. With India, it becomes a superstate. Earlier federalization changes India's development path in several ways. First, partition is either avoided, softened, or transformed into an internal federal settlement. The most plausible outcome is not a perfectly united India, but a looser South Asian Commonwealth Union inside the wider federation, with powerful Muslim-majority regions, Hindu-majority provinces, Sikh protections, princely state integration, and federal minority safeguards. Second, the military remains more integrated. Instead of the British Indian Army being divided between India and Pakistan, the federal system preserves a larger South Asian defense structure under regional command. This reduces the likelihood of repeated Indo to Pakistani wars, although it does not remove communal violence, separatism, or border disputes. Third, India receives earlier access to capital markets and technical education. The Federation invests heavily in rail electrification, ports, agricultural modernization, English language higher education, pharmaceuticals, computing, and civil service training. That does not erase poverty, but it accelerates state capacity. The moral cost is also real. Many Indian nationalists would view the Federation as a gilded cage, independence delayed under the language of partnership. Anti-federal movements would exist for decades. Some would be democratic. Some would be violent. The Federation's legitimacy would depend on whether Indians genuinely held power inside it. By the 1970s, that test becomes unavoidable. India's population means that no federal system can remain London-led forever. The capital functions begin to spread. London keeps finance, monarchy, intelligence heritage, and diplomatic prestige. Delhi becomes the demographic and political center. Singapore becomes the Asian trade node. Ottawa becomes the North American counterweight. Canberra becomes the Pacific defense hub. The empire survives, but the British become a minority inside the world they once ruled, the modern superstate. By 2026, the Commonwealth Federation would be one of the most powerful entities on Earth. Its exact size would depend on membership, but a plausible version includes the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, or a South Asian federal bloc, Singapore, Malaysia, parts of the Caribbean, several African member states, and a looser association with other former colonies that chose partnership over full integration. The real-world Commonwealth already represents a vast share of humanity, with official Commonwealth material describing a combined population of around 2.7 billion and projected GDP approaching $19.5 trillion by 2027. A tighter federal version would not automatically include every current Commonwealth member. But if India, Britain, Canada, Australia, parts of Southeast Asia, and major African economies remained inside, it would still be a demographic and economic giant. Its population could plausibly sit between 1.8 billion and 2.4 billion people, Depending on whether Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Malaysia, Kenya, South Africa, and other states remain full members or associate members, its nominal GDP could plausibly rival or exceed the United States and China if India's growth is accelerated by deeper capital access and if the Federation retains integrated trade, finance, and migration. Current World Bank data already places India, China, and the United States among the core pillars of the global economy, with India's scale increasingly central to long-term growth projections. Militarily, the Federation would be formidable. Britain contributes nuclear weapons, intelligence networks, and high-end defense industry. India contributes manpower, missile capability, a massive army, and Indian Ocean geography. Australia contributes Pacific basing and maritime reach. Canada contributes Arctic depth, energy security, and North American industrial capacity. Singapore and Malaysia contribute strategic choke point relevance near the Strait of Malacca. This would make the Federation the world's premier maritime superpower. It might not match America carrier for carrier, but it would control or influence a chain of strategic positions from the Atlantic to the Mediterranean, the Cape, the Gulf, the Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, and the Arctic. Its power would be less about occupying land and more about controlling movement. Technologically, the Federation would be unusually well positioned. Britain's universities, Canada's AI ecosystem, India's software sector, Australia's mining base, Singapore's advanced logistics, and South Africa's mineral depth would create a powerful innovation network. The Federation could become a leader in AI governance, fintech, biotech, defense software, satellite communications, nuclear energy, cyber intelligence, and pharmaceutical manufacturing. Its weakness would be complexity, a superstate spanning rich and poor regions, multiple religions, dozens of legal traditions, and huge demographic imbalance would not move quickly. Every major decision would trigger federal bargaining. Migration would be explosive. Tax transfers would be controversial. Defense priorities would clash. Climate policy would divide resource exporters from vulnerable island states. This would be the price of survival. The Federation would be powerful because it is vast, and unstable because it is vast. Britain in 2026. Britain in this world is richer, more globally connected, and less psychologically diminished than real-world Britain. It never experiences quite the same post-imperial identity crisis because it never fully loses the imperial network. London remains one of the Federation's financial, legal, diplomatic, and intelligence capitals. The city is not merely a British asset. It is the clearinghouse of a global federal economy. But Britain is also less sovereign in the emotional sense. Westminster no longer controls the system. British voters have to share power with hundreds of millions of Indians, Africans, Canadians, Australians, and Southeast Asians. Federal law overrides UK law in defence, external trade, migration rights, and strategic infrastructure. A British Prime Minister is important, but not supreme. This creates a strange political culture. British Conservatives are split between imperial federalists, who love global power, and national conservatives, who resent being outvoted inside the very structure Britain created. The left is split between anti-imperial Republicans and federal Social Democrats, who see the Commonwealth system as a tool for global redistribution, labour rights, and climate investment. Immigration becomes the defining domestic pressure. If there is federal citizenship, Britain cannot easily restrict movement from poorer member regions without undermining the entire constitutional bargain. The likely compromise is tiered mobility, automatic rights for skilled workers, students, military service families, and long-term federal citizens, with quotas and transition rules for poorer regions. Even then, Britain becomes more diverse earlier and more intensely than in real history. The monarchy survives longer in this timeline, but in a thinner constitutional form. It becomes a symbolic federal institution, rather than a British possession. That may preserve it, but it also dilutes it. The crown belongs to the Federation, not just to Britain. Culturally, Britain is more confident, but less culturally dominant. It is the old core of a system that has outgrown it. London is still powerful. Oxford, Cambridge, and imperial remain elite. British law remains influential. The BBC-style global voice may remain stronger, but the Federation's centre of gravity moves east and south. The uncomfortable truth is that Britain saves its global relevance by accepting its relative decline inside its own creation. Benefits and drawbacks. The benefits are enormous. A surviving Commonwealth federation could have reduced the violence of decolonization, preserved larger integrated markets, accelerated Indian development, softened some border conflicts, created a stronger democratic counterweight to China, and prevented Britain from shrinking into a medium-sized European state with imperial memories. It could also have created a more balanced Western order. America would still be powerful, but not as alone. Europe would still integrate, but not with the same assumption that Britain must choose between Washington and Brussels. India would likely become a superpower earlier. The Indian Ocean would become the strategic center of the democratic world. The Federation could also have reshaped globalization. Instead of the late 20th century being dominated by American capital, Chinese manufacturing and European regulation, there would be a fourth force, Commonwealth scale. English language law, Indian labor, Canadian resources, Australian minerals, British finance and Singaporean logistics could form one of the most powerful economic ecosystems in history. But the drawbacks are just as serious. The system could easily become a disguised empire, preserving economic hierarchy under federal language. Rich white settler states might dominate capital flows, while poorer Asian and African regions provide labor and resources. Britain might claim partnership while still protecting old privilege. India might find itself powerful on paper but constrained by federal vetoes. There is also the danger of civil breakdown. A federation this large would face separatist movements constantly. Irish republicanism, Indian nationalism, Muslim federal autonomy, African anti-imperialism, Caribbean republicanism, South African racial politics, Australian Pacific strategy, and Canadian North American identity could all pull in different directions. Holding the system together would require constitutional genius and relentless compromise. The moral problem never disappears either. Even if the Federation becomes democratic, it is born from empire. Its wealth, borders, institutions, and language are shaped by conquest. A federal settlement can change the future, but it cannot make the origin innocent. That is why this alternate history is plausible but not utopian. The British Empire could survive only by undergoing a political humiliation disguised as strategic brilliance. It would have to admit that imperial rule was finished before it was forced to admit it. It would have to trade command for influence, ownership for membership, and racial hierarchy for federal bargaining. Most empires fail because they cannot make that psychological leap. Final verdict. The British Empire could have survived until today, but not as the British Empire people imagine. It could not survive as red-coated nostalgia, colonial governors, imperial preference, and London issuing instructions to the world. That empire was already doomed by nationalism, war debt, American pressure, Soviet anti-colonial propaganda, Indian mobilization, and the moral force of self-determination, which became central to the United Nations decolonization framework after 1945. The only plausible surviving version is a federal Commonwealth superstate, democratic enough to hold legitimacy, flexible enough to manage difference, rich enough to reward membership, and strategic enough to give its members more power inside than outside. It would be less British, less white, less centralized, and less imperial with every decade. By 2026, such a federation would be one of the three great pillars of world politics, standing beside America and China. It would dominate the Indian Ocean, shape global finance, lead parts of the technology race, complicate Europe's development, constrain China's rise, and turn India into the demographic heart of a democratic superstate. Britain would remain globally important, but no longer because it ruled others. It would matter because it created a system too large to ignore. The deepest irony is that survival would require surrender. Britain would have to give up the empire in order to keep the network. It would have to stop treating colonies as possessions and start treating them as future partners. It would have to accept that the price of remaining a world power was no longer control, but dilution. That is the believable version. Not an empire frozen in 1897. Not a fantasy map with London still commanding the globe. A tense, powerful, unequal, democratic post-imperial federation that carries the empire's advantages and its sins into the modern age. The question is not whether the empire could have survived. The real question is what kind of world would exist if it had.